Thank you, Provost Johnson, and the Undergraduate Research Committee for inviting me to speak this morning. I've prepared a presentation that tells my story about my research and concludes with what I think will be a challenge to each of us as we embark on this celebration of curiosity and research today. Although it may seem at times that the presentation is directed directly toward faculty, every bit of what I'm about to share is fully applicable for students as future teachers, leaders, researchers, and lifelong learners. I would like to begin with a story. It's a story of a concept introduced to me in my first year of undergraduate study, a concept that I did not fully understand at the time and have spent 32 years trying to understand it more completely in my work. In my second semester of the freshman year at Morehead State University, in an 8 a.m. Introduction to Music Education course, Dr. Larry Blocker mentioned a phrase: comprehensive musicianship. He was referring to a seminal 1965 symposium at Northwestern University, a gathering of music educators who argued that music education had become too siloed. Performers were being trained to perform, theorists to theorize, and historians to historicize, all in relative isolation from each other. The symposium called for a more integrated approach, in which musical understanding was cultivated across all of its dimensions simultaneously. I was 18 years old and was probably still half asleep in that 8 a.m. class, but the phrase captured my attention. Comprehensive musicianship has been anchored in my mind, and I have returned to that lecture with increased understanding and stronger purpose ever since. Fast forward a few years to another key educational experience. In 2006, when I was a doctoral student in Dr. Cliff Madsen's Psychology of Music course at Florida State University, he began each class with something he called a transfer. It was a quick moment to jot down a brief paragraph or two connecting something outside of the class to topics we were studying in the class. These transfers served as a quick daily assessment of understanding. They allowed Dr. Madsen to get to know each of us better and to learn our writing styles. That's when I began to realize how connected everything was, or at least it could be, if I was willing to think about it and connect those dots. Today, I'd like to offer an argument grounded in educational research, in my own scholarly practice, and in 30 years of teaching experience, that the integrative concept of comprehensive musicianship describes something more universal than a philosophy of music pedagogy. Many of us in this room were trained at some point in our graduate education in the logic of the research funnel. The research funnel is a foundational framework in doctoral preparation. During the research process and over the course of the scholarly career, one's research is meant to narrow, to deepen, to become increasingly specialized until one arrives at an original contribution to a very specific area of a very specific field. There are many excellent reasons for this. The production of new knowledge requires depth. I'm not here to argue against specialization, but I would like to propose that the research funnel as a model tells an incomplete picture of how knowledge and new ideas actually develop. When I was preparing my dossier for promotion and tenure, I took a look at my body of work: composition, performance, conducting, pedagogy, and music technology. And although I was proud of the quantity of that work, I began to feel a sense of anxiety. My work had not narrowed. If anything, it had expanded. There were multiple threads leading in different directions, and I wasn't sure whether my department, the Promotion and Tenure Committee, or the administration would see that as a feature or as a flaw. The committee, as it turned out, saw this quantity and diversity as a strength, and I was granted tenure and promotion. Yay! That outcome prompted me to think about why I considered the breadth of my work to be a liability before I understood it to be an asset. And what does a misreading like that cost us as scholars and educators? Steve Jobs offered an observation in a 1996 Wired interview that creativity is just connecting things. Steve's statement, as with most of his remarks and ideas, is deceptively simple, but it contains a genuine claim. We don't always gain new understanding by going deeper in one field, but by noticing connections between fields that we hadn't linked before. This is an argument that expertise in isolation has a ceiling. And often, significant intellectual breakthroughs tend to occur at disciplinary boundaries, not at the centers. I'd like to show you what that's looked like in my own practice. Musical composition requires the investigation of historical and cultural contexts, the analysis of existing repertoire, the testing of hypotheses about musical structure and form, and the communication of these findings in a language, music notation, that is as precise as any other scholarly medium. When I compose music, I am doing scholarship. The distinction between knowing about music and knowing music from the inside, through the physical, cognitive, practical, and interpretive act of performance, is not solely experiential, as we say, playing music. This process is also how we understand and come to know the inner workings of music. Active performance keeps that knowledge alive, and it informs my teaching in ways that no amount of literature or textbooks on their own can substitute for. The ensemble conductor works within the domains of content knowledge, pedagogical practice, organizational leadership, and real-time communication. There is a great responsibility for the conductor to present music repertoire as the composer has intended it, with some of his own interpretation sprinkled in, communicating all of that information to the ensemble in the moment through nonverbal communication, while reacting to stimuli produced by that ensemble itself. I have drawn on the scholarship of leadership, on what distinguishes developmental and multiplier leadership from diminishing leadership, and on what Robert Greenleaf called servant leadership, in shaping my approach to the podium, to leading from the podium. And that same scholarship has shaped my approach to teaching in the classroom. Music technology entered my practice both as an area of specialization and as an enabler of connection. Initially, technology enhanced my ability to compose and allowed me to capture and edit music performances. Later, it presented itself as a resource to allow students to create artifacts, to share work beyond the classroom, and to see their learning as productive and public rather than evaluative and private, maybe an assignment that'd be tossed in the garbage at the end of the semester. The technology was never and should never be the point. The point should be what the technology has made possible. A pedagogy of creation rather than a pedagogy of reception. Each of these areas informs the other. Composition informs performance. Performance informs conducting. Conducting, at its core, is teaching. And teaching, if we're doing it well, sparks that curiosity that returns us back to research. Where the work and innovation actually happens is in those connections and within that cycle. At the University of Virginia's College at Wise, a small liberal arts college, I've had the opportunity to teach more than 20 distinct courses over the past 18 years, from Introduction to Music Reading, a beginner-level course, to Orchestration and Arranging, a senior-level course, from Applied Music Performance Instruction to an asynchronous online course titled Everyone Can Create Music with iPad. These are the joys and challenges of teaching at a small institution, and one of the primary reasons I love this institution. Not all of the courses I've just mentioned were the ones that I had been trained to teach or had even been required to take in my educational journey. One example, in my very first year, my colleague David Volk handed me a world music textbook and said, "You'll need this. We need you to teach this course next semester." I'll be honest, my first response was not one of enthusiasm, but my second response, after that initial alarm had passed, was one of curiosity. I had always been intrigued by music of other cultures, and this was my opportunity to dig in and learn more. And it was that curiosity, not the expertise, that got me through the course, and through counterpoint, and through oral skills. And now, these are my favorite courses to teach. What I discovered through that process was something I have come to think of as the pedagogical dividend of breadth. The more domains you have engaged with, the more you understand how learning in any domain actually works. The process of becoming competent in world music made me a better teacher of composition. Teaching music technology made me a more effective applied instructor. Teaching orchestration and composition made me a better conductor, and those connections continued to compound. In addition to my research, this realization also changed how I thought about assessment. In my upper division courses, students had always been expected to produce artifacts with some degree of choice, voice, and lots of creative options, such as original compositions, conducting performances, and scoring musical arrangements. This work was creative and generative, not simply evaluative. But in my introductory courses, I continued to default to those conventional assessments, primarily written examinations. Useful, certainly, but these were passive and did not reflect how I actually had come to understand for learning to work. So, I changed it. Students in music appreciation now produce original materials that become resources for future cohorts. Students in popular and world music create projects that outlive the semester. Students in my iPad course release original compositions into the world, their recordings on the very same platforms they access daily for their own musical consumption, that are now accessible for listeners they will never meet. Creativity and the opportunity to connect the pieces they are curious about in ways that interest them are now the standard practice. This approach draws on the scholarship of project-based learning and what Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe in Understanding by Design call transfer tasks. Do you recall those transfers mentioned earlier in Dr. Madsen's course? These are assessments that require students to apply learning in new contexts, making connections rather than simply using retrieval process. Podcasts present cross-cultural topics. Presentations focus on topics that students find intriguing and are genuinely curious about. The evidence for the efficacy of this approach, particularly in terms of student motivation and long-term retention, is substantial. The results from this shift have consistently exceeded what conventional assessment would have produced. When students understand that their work has an audience beyond their instructor, they invest in that work and they learn from it. I have described this with a phrase I first offered at an Apple Education Institute several years ago, and it continues to be a guiding philosophy in my work. When you cast the net wide, you will receive work beyond your expectations. It was originally a statement about pedagogy, but it's equally a statement about scholarship and about the kind of intellectual life we should model for our students. I want to pause now and ask you to do some work with the ideas I've shared. I'm going to offer 3 questions. These questions aren't rhetorical. I'm going to ask you to actually think about them, to ponder each one for a moment before I move to the next. If you want to write something down, please do. I would encourage you to, as the things that we name become important to us. Question 1. Where does your work already connect to something just outside the boundary of your field? A connection you might have recognized but perhaps never formally investigated or named. We'll give you a few seconds. Question 2. What are you curious about? Genuinely curious about, that you have put aside because it didn't seem directly relevant to your primary research agenda? What would it cost you to follow that curiosity for a semester? And question 3. Is there a discipline or a colleague on this campus whose work you've never engaged with? Not from disinterest, but simply from the momentum of staying in your own lane, doing your own work. What would a conversation with that person make possible? So I ask you to consider these questions because I've experienced the consequences of not asking these questions and then eventually taking advantage of opportunities that would change my work and my life. In 2016, I traveled to Ecuador to present a week-long music education workshop with some of my colleagues. I arrived unable to speak the language. I imagined that my experiences would be similar to my travels in Europe, where most, if not all, could speak English. Well, I was wrong. I had a difficult time communicating with some of my students. Kenny, on the right, could speak enough English to communicate. However, Jonathan could only say hi, Meester, and bye, Meester before we started our lessons, and I could not speak his language. Fortunately, there are many ways to communicate about teaching music, through modeling, gesture, and illustrating. Although connections were made and learning was made possible through some creative efforts, the experience was humbling in a way that was professionally clarifying for me. Upon returning home, I enrolled in 2 consecutive Spanish language courses on this campus and began a sustained engagement with language learning that I had not previously considered to be part of my scholarly identity. Which leads me to another topic that we'll save for another day of how sitting in a course as a student gave me a better perspective on the work our students do on a daily basis. I discovered something I hadn't sought out. The vocabulary of Western music is predominantly Italian, and the Italian language shares deep structural roots and cognates with Spanish, terms I had just assumed the definitions of in the past and been using for 40 years, had acquired a new etymology. I began to understand the roots of these terms. A language acquisition project that I had undertaken to remedy a practical deficit turned out to have direct implications for my disciplinary content knowledge. In addition, learning a new language allowed me to form strong friendships and partnerships with colleagues from Ecuador, Chile, and Spain, which allowed for international travel, collaborations, and continue to prove to be beneficial for me and my students. I had taken one step out of my field and made connections I could not have anticipated. And that is the point. What I've been describing is not unique to music, and it's not even unique to the arts. This is a structural feature of how knowledge deepens. The compartmentalization of academic work, the clean separation from teaching, from research, of one discipline from another, of the classroom from the world, serves important functions for administration and evaluation, but it can obscure the most productive sites of intellectual work, which tend to be those spaces between each of those compartments. Sir Ken Robinson, whose decades of work on creativity and education influenced an entire generation of scholars and practitioners, argued that curiosity is not a disposition incidental to learning, it is the mechanism by which learning happens at all. His quote, "Curiosity is the engine of achievement," is a succinct description of the cognitive process itself. The implications for how we structure our scholarly lives and how we design our courses are significant. If curiosity is the mechanism, then anything that expands that range of what we are curious about expands our capacity for meaningful work. Work that is meaningful to us, meaningful to our students, and to our disciplines. Maybe it's a comprehensive scientist, or a comprehensive mathematician, or historian. For scientists, maybe it's a connection to music that could be the acoustics of natural environments, the relationship between animal communication and music. For mathematicians, the geometry of tuning systems, rhythms itself, the relationship between mathematical structure and the aesthetic experience. For historians, the music of a period and how music and culture interact. For linguists and language educators, the patterns of rhythms and how the sounds of a language as a foundation from which music it grows. These are descriptions of established research programs that began when someone decided to follow a curiosity across a disciplinary boundary. The strength of this idea is not that we master everything, but that by connecting what we know, we understand it more deeply. I want to return to where we began, Room 117 at Morehead State University, and to the morning Dr. Blocker introduced me to that term comprehensive musicianship. A couple months ago, I had the honor of returning to that room as a guest conductor for the Morehead State Band Clinic. I stood on the podium at the front of that same rehearsal space where I had sat as a confused and sleep-deprived freshman. I conducted, I taught, and I introduced those young musicians to my own arrangement of My Old Kentucky Home, which was an homage to my formative years in the other Commonwealth, and my most recent composition for concert band, Radiant Revelry, which you're hearing here. The circle had closed, or more precisely, the circle had revealed itself to have been there all along. What I could not see at 18, and what the logic of the research funnel does not always help us to see, is that the seemingly disparate things we are drawn to are often expressions of a single deeper coherence. The composer and the performer, and the conductor, and the teacher are not competing identities, they are facets of a single intellectual project. Carol Dweck, the author of one of my favorite books, Mindset, reminds us that becoming is better than being. I take that to mean the process of integration, the process of finding and making connections across domains is the work. It doesn't distract us from that work. I do not see myself as a composer who teaches, a teacher who performs. I see connections between these things, the connections that give the whole idea of comprehensive musicianship its meaning. So maybe I'm not a jack of all trades, master of none, as they say, but rather a jack of all trades, master of some, with the connections to be able to see the whole picture. I want to close with something concrete. As we know, abstract arguments have a magical way of leaving us as we move beyond the hall and into the hallways. Today's Research Day program presents or represents the breadth of inquiry that is happening all across this campus. The range of questions being asked, the range of methods being employed, and the range of problems being addressed. All these are, in the strongest sense of the word, remarkable. I often think about Dr. Blocker standing in the front of that classroom, mentioning a concept in passing, almost certainly unaware that at least one student in the room would be shaped by it. We never know which sentence might stick with a student, as this one did. We never know which idea, offered almost casually in the course of a lecture, plants itself in someone and grows. If you're presenting a session today, please remember that last statement. Your work is exceptional and has the potential to spark curiosity in others in ways that you may never come to know. Present with that purpose in mind. So here's what I'm asking. Look at today's program. Find one session that has nothing to do with your work, a research question you have no professional obligation to answer. Go to that session, and while you're there, ask yourself how it connects. Assume that there is a connection. It is your task to find it. That shift in thought is the difference between a closed and an open mindset. It's the difference between a scholar who has mastered a domain and a scholar who is still becoming a scholar. A lifelong learner, a jack of all trades, master of some. The work on this campus is extraordinary. Celebrate it today. Engage with it across lines. Let it enrich what you already know. Let curiosity be the engine.